Good morning again. If anyone has ever read the labels, the warning label on your rear view mirrors or your side view mirrors, it says objects may appear larger than they really are. My head is probably going to appear larger than it really is on this particular video, but I want to thank Mike and all of his efforts. I want to thank everybody who's had a hand in helping us to get through this worship service this morning, and I especially want to thank you for being here. The last few weeks we've been looking at a sermon series entitled The God Story. And we, as human beings, connect to stories. Stories get our attention in a way that a formula or a definition may not. And though Jesus was known to quote scripture from time to time, his primary way of teaching was through story. When Jesus wanted to convey a hard-to-explain spiritual truth, he didn't preach a three-point sermon, have a poem, and then a song. He told a story. And in our story, the God story, we've seen that the Bible is not a disconnected collection of historical accounts, but rather a story that helps us connect with the mysterious truths of God. Though it can be helpful at times to take a verse here or take a verse there, we all seek to hear the whole story of the Bible. The connection from Genesis to Jesus, and from Jesus beyond. And we've talked about the elements of a good storytelling the first few weeks here in this God Story series. We've looked at a good introduction. That's where you learn important information about the main character. We talked about the suspension of disbelief, where you ask the reader to suspend their logic and critical faculties to believe the fantastic. We looked last week at a thing called the rising action. It's a critical time in the story where the protagonist faces conflicts and obstacles. This week, we learned that any good story, play, or movie must have a clear inciting incident. The inciting incident is a moment in a script that kicks the story into motion. It occurs after the setup, and everything that follows the inciting incident should be a result of that incident. It's where a story really gets going. It's that moment in the script where the protagonist's world is turned upside down and he or she must then set about resolving the change in circumstances that the incident has brought about. It's generally a clear and defined moment that's easily identifiable, like the plane crash in Castle Bay, or when Bruce Wayne's parents are killed in front of him, that sparks him to become the Batman. James Scott Bell likens the inciting incident to a doorway through which the protagonist cannot return. And when you come to this inciting incident, it creates friction, a disturbance, an imbalance, sometimes a sense of chaos or doom or gloom. There's a pending uneasiness about it, a disharmony, if you will. And our reaction as readers and listeners or viewers is a longing for resolution, the desire for the lost things to be found, for the good to win out, for good to win over evil, for right to win over wrong. That's what I believe God has placed within the heart of all men, a strong desire for resolution to conflict. The Bible is such a story. It's a story of hope. It's a story of life. It's a story of history. It's a story for all eternity. And along the way, we see inciting incidents, places where things are out of harmony. Things seem to be in chaos. Things seem to be an imbalance. And if we continue to read that story, we find that at some point it will be resolved. Our story, the God story, begins with the author and the main character creating and writing the story into existence. We hear of God's love for creation, in which he desires not to be a far-off and an aloof God, but one who is involved. In fact, a God who speaks to his creation. And that was the first thread that we see through all the Bible. When we read this entire thing from cover to cover, we see this thread that God desires relationships. God's creation, man and woman, chose their own way, betraying the trust of their Creator, rejecting their God. And yet God continues to hold out a promise to them and to all those who come after. He gives a laughable dream to an old man named Abraham and his wife Sarah. And he keeps that promise by giving them a son at the age of 100. And that was the second thread that we looked at, that when God makes a promise, he keeps it. Abraham's lineage did become a great nation. The promise was kept, for they did take the promised land. But because God kept his promises, he didn't say there wouldn't be hardship. He didn't say that there wouldn't be suffering. He didn't say that perhaps you may even go into slavery. And we talked last week about how this people was delivered from slavery and led out into the wilderness. And even in that wandering time, that transition time, God provided all that they needed. And that was our third thread, that God will provide all that you need for the journey. This wandering people did make it to the promised land. They were a people who were centered on one common thing, the God they served. Their connection was not based on physical boundaries or a human leader, only their God. And then they did something surprising, something unnecessary. They asked for a king. They saw other nations had kings, and they didn't. They asked Samuel, who was the prophet to the people, go ask God to give us a king. It was at that point that they had rejected God as their king. 1 Samuel chapter 8 tells us that story. And Samuel will tell them all the pitfalls of having a man to be their leader. And yet they still cried out for a human king. The first king was Saul, someone who stood head and shoulders above the rest. And sure enough, he ended up getting a big head. Note the big head. And wanting power and glory for himself. And so in the story that we read this morning, God tells Samuel to go and anoint another king. This is where we're introduced to David, who would become a great king. In fact, David would become the one whose lineage the Messiah, Jesus, would run through. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself in the story. Samuel is told to go to the family of Jesse, who had 8 sons. And when Samuel gets there, he sees the sons, strong, attractive men. And Samuel says, oh yeah, I'm in the right place. But as each of the 7 older sons come before Samuel, God says over and over again, not that one. No, not that one. Not that one either. And Samuel asks, are these all the sons you have? And Jesse answers, they're the youngest. He's tending the sheep. And Samuel says, get him. We will not sit down until he gets here. We will not eat. We will not rest. We will have this tension mounting until you go get this son. And David, the youngest, with the most humble of jobs, being a shepherd, is brought before Samuel, and the Lord speaks and says, he is the one. Imagine the scene. David, a young boy, possibly preteen in age, 12, 13 years old, the youngest of 8 strong and powerful sons. David stands before everyone. He stands before his father. He stands before his 7 older brothers. He stands before the prophet and the priest Samuel. More importantly, David is standing before God. The old prophet, who's the most revered person in the nation, takes a horn of precious and valuable oil and pours it over the dirty little shepherd boy who had probably spent the night before sleeping in a field. And he tells him, you will be the king of Israel. And here's where some tension starts to mount. Here is the beginning of our inciting incident. The current king is still alive and healthy. And David, not related. He is not scheduled to inherit the kingdom from Saul. But Samuel says that David will reign on the throne of Israel. And he says that because God says that. And that's a good story. David, as we read the God story, is one of the main characters. He gets a lot of print. And this moment is his inciting incident. This is the everything has changed moment. This is the there's no going back now moment, part of the story. Everything that follows in his life begins in this moment. David is standing at the doorway and he chooses to go through. And by going through, at that moment, David is given, if not a new story, a better story. David is thrust into the story. He was unsuspecting, undeserving, caught by surprise, but chosen by God. And this is our fourth thread that we see all throughout the Bible, all throughout the God story. And we're going to see it again. God calls the unlikely and gives them a better story. When we think about Noah, he called Noah to save humankind. With Abraham and Sarah, he called him out of the land of Chaldea to be a father of nations, to be the mother of nations. Joseph, who was meant to die in a pit by his brother's hands, God had different plans for him, took him down to Egypt, and the entire nation was saved because of his efforts. Moses, who was to be killed by a Pharaoh, started life by living in a wooden basket in the river. Rose to be second in command or third in command in Egypt, and then killed a man. Walks into the desert for 40 years tending sheep, and God calls him out of there, and he says, lead my people. Ruth, Esther, and now David, being called into a better story. And the list is going to go on and on and on. God calls the unlikely and gives them a better story. And here's what David does. He embraces the better story. He willingly steps through that door. He willingly goes through that door to the inciting incident. And his life will never be the same. Something in that moment clicked in his mind. And for some reason, he said, I'm going to do this. He would be the one to slay a giant with a small stone. He would be the one to play his harp for the king who would try to kill him. He would be the one who would be a hunted fugitive on the run. He would fight bravely in battles. He would murder. He would commit adultery. And despite all of his faults, despite some terrible things that he does, despite some obvious pride and some obvious arrogance, he is a good and faithful king. And how do I know this? Because God says about him, David is a man who chases, a man who pursues, a man whose desire is my own heart. But that moment, that come to the house, the great Samuel is here. And he wants to see you. That running in from the field moment, that arriving out of breath moment, that covered in dust and standing before his father, standing before his brother, standing before the prophet Samuel, and possibly hearing the voice of God saying he is the one with sweat and oil dripping off of his brow. It was that moment, that inciting incident, that David's life was changed forever. And God called the unlikely and gave him a better story. The inciting incident is a doorway through which you cannot return. What is your doorway? What inciting incident has happened in your life? Maybe something recent. You're fired. You're laid off. Maybe it's, will you marry me? Maybe it's, I'm pregnant. Maybe it's, I want a divorce. Maybe it's, He's not coming back. Maybe it's cancer. Whatever it is, you are thrust into the story, your story. Remember, we've talked about this. This is God's story, and we are a part of it. This is your story. Whether you meant for it to happen or not, you are a part of this story. This is now your story. What this story tells us is that whatever hand life has dealt us, whatever story we think we are destined to, God, remember, He is all-powerful. He is the Creator God. He is the God who desires relationships. He is the God who is the promise keeper. He is the God who provides for the journey. This God has called you, called us to a better story. If you consider yourself unlikely, unwanted, then I'm persuaded you're precisely who God wants to talk to. And Jesus was big on this as well. When we read the New Testament, there's a thread that runs through there that Jesus himself will call unlikely peoples and give them a better story. It happened with the blind man. It happened with the leper. It happened with a woman who had a bleeding problem. It happened for tax collectors. It happened for fishermen. It happened for the demon-possessed. It happened for prostitutes. He called them out and gave them a new story. And He called you out and He gave you a new story. I think sometimes we forget who we are. We forget who is writing the story for us. God has not written a story for you that includes abuse and misuse. No, the devil has a hand in some of those pages as well. And he is the one who is trying to drive a wedge between you and God. He is trying to rewrite your story in His image. But God says, if you'll trust me, I desire that relationship with you. I will keep my promises. I will provide for your journey. And I am calling you to a better story. Unlikely though you may be, God has written a better story for you. And not only that, God can use your story to help others find a better story. As we close out this morning, understand this. Each one of those encounters that Jesus had was an inciting incident for that person. When you encounter Jesus, that is your inciting incident, the main one in your life. Oh, there are other ones that come and go. But it's that moment that will change your life forever for the better. It may not look like it sometimes. It may not feel like it sometimes. And you may look around scratching your head in awe and wonder going, where am I at? Have faith. Believe that God has a better story for all of us. Believe that God has a better story for you. Believe that when you walk through that doorway and encounter Jesus and you connect to Jesus, it's a doorway you'll never want to walk back through. I pray that your day is filled with love and grace and mercy. And as we all strive to just endure what's going on in our world today, may God's peace go with you. Shalom.